Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome at the first keynote of the Impakt Festival at Theatre Kicker. Tonight's guest is Evan Roth. We're very happy to have him. Moderator of tonight is Petra Heck. And Petra Heck is a freelance curator, amongst others, for Taak and Today's Art, and focuses on contemporary media art, performances and online public space, art in online public space. Evan Roth has been a guest a few years ago at an Impakt event on digital graffiti, and we're very happy to have him here again. Please, a warm welcome for Evan Roth.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. And yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's not always you get invited to come talk about your newer, less entertaining work. So thank you for that. I'm happy to do it. Hopefully it goes over well. I'm going to talk a bit about my work, and I'm going to try to talk about my work chronologically, which I feel like might make sense given the theme. I'll try to connect a few threads, hopefully, that'll be more clear as I go on. But the work that I'm making generally shows up in the gallery and in public space and in the internet, not usually at the same time. But those are the kind of spheres that I'm making art for. And one thing that I think connects some of the work I'm going to show, which kind of will look very different at times, is this relationship between misuse and empowerment, right? And how these two things can work together. And this idea of misuse, I think of as this lens that you can look at the world around us, but specifically at technology, right? And so if you kind of think about misuse when we're looking at everything, right? Whether it's Roombas or iPhones or just whatever we're interacting with, right? The misuse of these systems ends up usually being more interesting than the technology that it was originally designed for, right? And so I show this slide a bunch. I love the Doom. This is like from the Doomba meme. Like I didn't make this. Like I really wish I had made this. But yeah, the idea of duct taping knives to something, the idea of throwing lasers or LEDs at things. Like this is like anytime we start misusing these technologies and treating them with less respect, I think we're usually on the right track. So that's a kind of means that I employ. So the two more specific threads I'm going to try to weave through this is one, this idea of technological empowerment, and the other, visualization through misuse. And I'm also going to try to tie this back to kind of how I became an artist. Like I came through design. I went to undergraduate in architecture, and I had one class in the architecture building. I mean, this was like a long time ago, right? Like, I mean, I was literally like learning how to draft with like pencils on paper and do hand lettering with pencils. It was like a freaking whole nother era, right? But there was one computer class in the building where they were teaching us how to like get introduced to computers, mostly so that we could make architectural portfolio websites. And there was this one moment in the class where the teacher pulled up this like Fetch window. Does anybody remember Fetch from the old school Mac days? And he pulled up this FTP application and explained to me like, okay, here's your computer, and I just wrote some code, and I'm going to put this into the Fetch, and this dog's going to run it up to the internet. And then he refreshed the browser, right? And of course it changed with what he wrote. And to me, like we kind of were brushing on this in Aaliyah's talk, like for me this was like a huge moment, right? Like we sort of take for granted these things now, but for me at the time, like I just couldn't believe it. Like, you mean I can talk to how many people and how much does it cost and who regulates it? And I couldn't believe that system was in place. And I would go on to graduate in architecture and work in architecture for a few years, but I was like constantly coming home from work and playing on the internet and more playing on the internet at work, and then decided to go back to school to focus on that. But it was that one sort of like experience with what technological empowerment felt like that really doomed my architecture career and doomed me into going into the arts. So how that manifested in some of my kind of like earlier work was, and this is going to overlap briefly with the presentation I gave. Was that 2011? Was that? Yes. Because it feels like, yeah, it feels like 100 years ago to me now for some reason, but I guess in internet years, it's a long time ago. But I was making, for a while I co-founded this project with a friend named James Powderly in New York, a graffiti research lab. And we were really functioning, like looking back on it more as activists than artists, I think, but we were making tools that were trying to promote free speech issues and free culture issues, but specifically for graffiti writers and activists. I'll show one of those projects. This is called Laser Tag, which is one of our more popular software suites that we release. And so, just as an example of the work we are trying to make, this is a system where we would go and set it up in the city, usually without permission, and we would invite graffiti writers and we would invite activists, and the only kind of rule that we had when we were participating in this project was there couldn't be any censor button, right? And it turned into this for a lot of people, it was like their first introduction to what free software was or what open source culture was. Or specifically for graffiti writers, we're trying to figure out hacks, because these are a community of hackers as well, hacking spray paint cans and marker tips. And for them, those were like trade secrets. And so part of the idea was like trying to convince graffiti writers, which was essentially a hacking community, to function more like hackers and have this knowledge share. So anyway, these were the kind of projects we were making as Graffiti Research Lab. The work that we were doing with Graffiti Research Lab at one point, James and I were realizing that the kind of tech hacks that we were doing were usually less interesting than social hacks, right? And that we were kind of figuring out how we could play against the media's natural inclination to write the story that we are living in the future, which is what every newspaper wants to write about, right? And so when we were giving them these visions of graffiti writers with lasers, we were like fulfilling this narrative for them. And that narrative allowed them to write about the projects we were making, which essentially would promote the speech of these like semi-marginalized groups. And so with thinking about that, we sort of changed the group and we took the momentum that Graffiti Research Lab had and put it into this other group called the Free Art and Technology Lab, which was essentially the same project, but without this, focusing more on this idea of a social hack and using the internet and kind of taking advantage of what we saw as this loophole in a specific time of the internet where this idea of viral media or contagious media hadn't been figured out people hadn't figured out how to monetize it yet. And so we could use that in order to spread other messages. So this is one project we did where we basically rented this car and put a Google logo on it and bought a roof rack. And then everything above the roof on this car is just made out of cardboard and tape, right? So there's no technology in the car. So it's purely like a social hack. And this was from the first time we did it in Berlin, which is quite a while ago now. But essentially we just like drove the car around and acted a fool, right? Like tried to put Google in a position that would be compromising. And we had leaked to the media that we'd put a GPS device on the Google car and that we had footage of them drinking and driving and urinating in public. And this is one where we tried to stage a carjacking, which if you want to know how strong Google's brand is, this is like a do-gooder off the street coming in to risk his life to save the Google car. You know, if you talk about like brand awareness, like I only told him we were making a movie when he reached into his coat for something. I was like, whoa, not worth it. And so we were making this kind of content that even Franco Mates call radical entertainment. It's this idea that you can make like politically charged content that people might not click on because they agree with your politics, because they want to see you making fun of Google or having fun in public, and then we would see these little messages at the end, right? And this was kind of the operating principle of FAT. We didn't have any like regulated mandate or any manifesto, but this is kind of how the group was operating. So these are some collaborative projects. At the same time, I was also making solo projects that were sort of along similar themes. This was from a project in Vienna a few years ago now called Free Speech. A similarly pretty simple construct. So this is a rented van with a local Viennese cell phone number on the side that has this red arrow pointing to the roof where there's a giant speaker. And that's kind of the entire setup you get as a spectator of this piece. And so we just drove around Vienna for 3 days to different neighborhoods. And if people were curious to call the number, there was no voice on the other end of the line. They would just hear their own voice as they were like, hello, you know, and then it would be hello. And they'd have this moment where, you know, a minute ago they were just out getting coffee, and the next second they have this like public platform to address the community with. So I'll play just a minute of what that looks like.
Hello. Hello. It is the champion.
Hallo.
Hallo.
Oh, geil.
Fick dich. Fick dich.
Fick dich. Claudia, ich liebe dich.
Abonniert das auch schon gewünscht.
Hallo?
Hallo?
Nice! Geil! So fresh, Mann.
Haut's rein.
Tschüss.
And So I have more documentation of that piece, and people do other things. People are reading poetry and doing all kinds of things. But the ones I chose to include in this clip are some of my favorites because they're these really honest reactions to what technological empowerment feels like, right? Like the guy who picked up the phone and understood the construct and then just started laughing the entire time. Like to me, these are like more beautiful in a sense than the people that kind of figured it out and said something maybe more intelligent or more related to some political event or something like, or this guy that just picks it up and is like, nice, like that's the face of technological empowerment, right? And so that's one strain of work, like relatively simple tools that lead to these moments where you have bigger agency than you were maybe meant to have. So a second strain of work that I was making combined in this same period, but maybe a little bit more recently, has to do more with visualizing our relationship to this era that we're going through right now, right? Which of course has to do with technology and the internet. And trying to like come up with some way of understanding what it is and what it looks like, and also coming up with ways to save it. And so this first series I'm going to show is called No Original Research. So No Original Research is one of Wikipedia's core tenets. And I made this series of 11 websites kind of as a homage, like a tribute to Wikipedia, as one of the last holdouts on the internet of places that has upload occurring that's not ego-driven, right? Like there's so few places on the current internet where people are uploading content that doesn't have to do with themselves, right? And I don't mean necessarily directly themselves, but like when we're Instagramming our flight or our food or what music we're listening to, we're always kind of like crafting these online avatars in a sense, right? Even if we're not in the photo. And to me, Wikipedia is this really beautiful place that has some of these values of the earlier web where people they just wanted to explain what a Doronut is, and so they made this really beautiful animation, right? Or they wanted to explain how a Boxer engine works, right? Constant Dollart, who's another artist whose work I really like, he talks about media that has an alibi, right? Like media that has a reason for existing. And so Wikipedia to me is full of this kind of content. And so I made these series of websites where I would essentially, I first spent a long time surfing Wikipedia, which was like an amazing way to spend a summer. And specifically, I was looking for animated GIF content. And when I found ones that I wanted to highlight, I would take the GIF and I would copy it hundreds of times. And I would have the file names numbered sequentially. So there was, BoxerEngine.1, BoxerEngine1.gif, BoxerEngine2.gif. And the reason that's important is because then when the browser tries to pull all these GIFs into one frame, it doesn't cache them as a singular image. It thinks they're all different images, which is impossible to load all at once. And so what happens is you end up watching the kind of packets as they're traveling through the network, right? In this linear fashion where the browser's asking for packets and sending packets, and you're seeing it kind of load in. And so the composition that you get left with isn't this perfect circle, right? Because the web is not a perfect system. And instead, you're left with kind of this imperfect circle that's in a sense kind of a visualization of these packets as they traveled through the network and got to your browser. And in one way, like each viewing in some way is kind of unique, right? Because you can never recreate all the factors to make this happen the exact same way twice. Like even if it's the same computer on the exact same network, the path that those packets are going to travel through the network is probably not exactly the same. So if you view these pieces in the Tor browser, for example, so the Tor browser I think we're mostly familiar with, right, is a sort of browser that has anonymity as a primary function, and it routes packets in a different way, where it's routing packets not in this linear fashion, but distributing through these different Tor nodes throughout the network so that their exit point is not the same. And when you load these pieces in through the Tor browser, you can kind of see that you're traversing the network in a different way as it loads in. And then when it finishes, you have a slightly different composition, right? A composition that's not made from...
No original research.
Oh yeah, there's audio
from
too, I forgot.
Wikipedia.
A composition that's not made from a linear path through the network, but one that's more distributed. And so these pieces end up becoming these kind of visualizations of the network as well as a tribute to this community of Wikipedians. Another series of mine that has to do with visualizing the web is called Internet Cache Portraits. And this series comes from a small change I made to my browser, which I just basically increased my cache. You can set in the preferences, right, how often you want your computer to overwrite the data that it's collecting when it browses. And so I increased that as high as Firefox would allow me to go. And so now, because of course when we're on the web, right, we're never really on the web. We're connecting to a server, downloading images locally that we see in the browser. And they go into this like cache directory, which is this kind of very specific place on computers, which is one of the only directories that gets overwritten by default, right? It doesn't ask you, do you want to overwrite the directory? It's just going to collect 100 megabytes worth of JPEGs, and then it's going to start overwriting them. And so for the past 3 years, every few weeks, I archive that. And so I have this collection of every image that's passed through my browser for the last 2 or 3 years now. And when I get invited to show the piece, I kind of wait as long as I can until the opening, and then send this data off to the printer and make these pieces. This is 1 month of browsing data. This is what 3 months worth of browsing data looks like. And it becomes, I think of them as portraits only because it's me, and it ends up only being me because it's a really hard ask of somebody, right? I've done portraits of other people, of friends, and it's a really sort of intimidating and intimate invitation to be like, hey, I wanted to make this portrait, can you please give me access to your cache directory, right? Especially if you ask them for the cache directory without the foreknowledge that I want it, you know? It's like asking for the footage from a security camera you didn't know was in your living room and your bedroom and your kitchen and at work, right? Because we leave all these trails. And so it ends up a lot of times being myself, because I'm sort of training myself to forget about that security camera as much as I can. And the only thing I actively censor from them is when there's banking data that you can kind of discern from it. And so in the one sense, it's about me, but in a greater sense, it's meant to be really about the internet, like this snapshot of the internet, of one person's experience of the internet at this specific moment in time. Because of course, as everything's changing, right? Browser sizes are changing, and screen resolutions, and internet protocols, and computers are moving to our pockets, and they're becoming touch screens. And as all these things are changing, I mean, as we saw in the movie that we saw from Corey Archangel, it's going to be harder and harder to sort of go back and look at what these things looked like in their native format, right? And so these long prints that end up in these rolls after the show is finished are now being stored in my Cov. But to me, these scrolls are sort of an interesting archive of the web where people can then look back and see, they can see what the image sizes were, they can see what people were looking at, they can see how people were monetizing it. And it's all sort of collected in these prints that hopefully won't change much as the piece gets older. And that idea of time is something that I'm starting to think about in my work a lot more lately, because the internet is putting a lot of pressure, I'll say on me, but I think on a lot of artists, to communicate artwork like in this instant that happens on Instagram, right? And so I think art making gets tricky, because if you start listening to that too much, you end up with these pieces that end up being these one-liners that get consumed in a second. And even if you get that sort of, you get that like and you feel good, you're left with a kind of piece that's only aiming at a very low barrier for what you could communicate with an art piece. And so now I'm trying to deal with work that's thinking about those two spheres in real ways, where there might be one interaction with that piece as you're giving it a half a second when you're scrolling through Instagram, but there might be something else if you sort of sit with the piece longer, or if you look at the piece in 10 years or 100 years. And so, as an example, this is a piece called Slide to Unlock, which is from a series called Multi-Touch Paintings that I've been making, where very simple construct. I'll take tracing paper that's cut to the shape of my phone, and I'll put it over the phone, and you can see the pixels through the tracing paper, and the capacitive touch still works through the tracing paper. And then I just perform the interactions that user experience designers ask me to do, right? So I'll ink my thumb, and then I'll slide to unlock, and then scan it and print it out, and it becomes these pieces that are, on the one hand, they're this representation of the moment that we're in now, right? In this moment where, for the first time, human beings are doing this now 20 times a day, right? There was no time in our evolution when we had need to do this, right? Or this is a diptych called zoom in, zoom out, right? This is something we're all doing again. Like we're the first generation that's having to do this. This one's called next, 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 right? And so this one, like, is also commenting on how culture is now consumed, right? Like it's, this JPEG of this image is probably consumed more like this than it is hanging on a wall in a museum, right? And so some of it's about archiving these first moments that, even though they're happening on technologies like the iPhone 6 and it feels so high tech, but this interaction feels so blunt, right? It feels so kind of like, okay, next, next, next. And so it's meant to capture some of that. It's meant to capture some of these movements, kind of like the bug in the amber, like, so that as we're looking back on this time that maybe feels high tech now, there might be something about it that looks different later, right? Fitting with the theme, hopefully. This series I also do kind of in mass, right? So this is a related piece called Level Cleared. and it's composed of 1,540 sheets of these tracing papers, and it's me playing the game Angry Birds from start to finish. And so, like the upper left-hand corner, it's hard to see here, but in the upper left-hand corner is level 1-1, and I just sit down and I put one piece of paper per level, whether I beat it or not, and I just keep marching through the entire game, which takes me about 3 full days in the studio, like 3 10-hour days of playing Angry Birds. Yeah, and so this piece, again, like when I'm thinking about these like multiple sort of paths that art can communicate on, I think that they're, like, I like that people laugh when they see this piece. That's sort of, I hope, built into the piece. There's this pop culture reference point where people can sit with it very quickly, and if they just hear the word Angry Bird, they can kind of understand that this is the visualization. It kind of seems funny in the sense that maybe this is like a big waste of someone's time, right? But then that also, the reason I like to install this with a bench in front of it is because, like, I'll put myself into the piece. Like when I sit on that bench in front of this piece, right? I also, like, for a second think, oh my God, I wasted a lot of time, right? But then I start looking at this and I don't even see Angry Birds anymore. I just see that I don't speak French. I just see that, like, I don't jog as much as I should have, you know? I see all the people I'm losing touch with, all the ways that, like, we hope that we spend our time, and thinking about this idea of, like, when computers moved into our pockets as being sort of a big moment, right? That, you know, what people are calling casual computing. This was like a big move where now they're always sort of asking for our attention, and it's, we're on the subway train or we're in line at the grocery store, it's kind of calling to you, and it's being like, oh, kill some pigs, you know, flick some birds. And all these little gestures that we're kind of slowly giving away to these devices and these apps, they don't go nowhere, right? They turn into something. And so this piece was kind of, it was meant to be a reaction to that, and it was meant to have both humor built in, but also, like, I hope that people, if you sit in this bench and it kind of ends up feeling crushing, it's supposed to have this, like, also this darker side to it. So I'm making all that work, right? And through the course of making that work, the internet changed a lot. And we've been sort of talking about it in the last panel with Olia, we talked about it, Evgeny talked about it yesterday. And this is something that had a big effect on me too, because the internet, as I said in the beginning, was like the whole reason I kind of quit architecture and went into the arts. And I don't feel a need to go into what happened, because I know everybody in here knows about it based on what we've been talking about, but I'll just address it how I see it, right? And one thing was I saw that the internet at some point wasn't functioning like the Big Bang model anymore. It wasn't that the internet happened and it distributed and everybody had a GeoCities page and everybody was starting their own servers and there was a forum for everything and everybody was a publisher and it was supposed to be this thing that was going to empower the masses. And it was more and more servers and more people to talk with. And then at some point it seemed like that stopped, right? And it started shrinking. And like now, we have, of course, like one server where our friends are and one server where we buy things and one server for everything else, right? And another few years will probably be less than 3 servers. And then all of a sudden it's like the universe is operating on this big crunch model rather than the Big Bang model where it expands and then it contracts to where it came from. So this was like one thing I saw happening that wasn't exciting to me. And then the monetization of the web, which we all know about, right? And this one was like a surprise to me too, because like we all hated these Google ads, but they were kind of just a funny thing that we fluffed off, right? Like, oh yeah, like Google's reading my email and then inserting these little ads, but I don't even see them, it doesn't really matter, right? But it kind of all goes back to targeted marketing where like the shit kind of hit the fan, right? Like these companies, especially Google, started doing this targeted marketing very, very well, making these big databases, and then when the government comes and taps them on the shoulder, right, they just snitch on all of us on this like unprecedented snitching scale, right? And so the third thing was, of course, the spying thing. Like this had a big effect on me, but I like to talk about the other two because it wasn't just the spying thing. It was like the internet was kind of already headed in this direction that didn't feel like the internet I fell in love with, and then the spying thing happened. And then maybe a related thing that I saw happening was like all the companies that show up in this slide, I still use some of them. You know, like I hate it, but like I need to talk to my dad, so I call him on Skype, or like I need to figure out where I'm going, and I still use Google Maps. And so this idea that like the worst thing ever could happen, and that's not even enough for me to quit using these products and boycott them completely. Like I don't even know I don't know where to go from there. You know, like that for me personally. And so I started viewing the internet more like this, right? Where the cats that I thought were running the internet were actually these Trojan lolcats, right? And that they look cute and we kind of let them into our lives, but then they just started like shitting cookies in our browsers and like tracking our data and then marketing things to us very, very efficiently. And so now the problem I'm having is like an artist whose work is invested in the internet and inspired by the internet is like, I don't even see the lolcats anymore. Like when I look at this, I just see like the fur peeling back and this like chrome skull and like the Terminator eye, you know what I mean? And it's funny on the one hand, but for me it was like a real point where I had to start thinking about what I was doing, you know? And at the beginning of this year, I don't know if anyone saw the talk that Peter Sunday gave at Transmediale. I wasn't there, but I saw it on YouTube. So for me, the Peter Bira and the kind of Swedish hacker think tank that birthed the Pirate Bay, they're like my cultural heroes. Like I still am in contact with people connected to that community and still am really inspired by the things they've done, not just the Pirate Bay, but the Pirate Bay is like, I think it's the best thing that's ever been made in my lifetime and probably will continue to be. And so he's like a cultural hero, right? And he gets on stage and he gives this talk, which I won't play, but I'll leave in the notes, which I'll give a link to at the end. And he basically says, we lost. There's no point in struggling anymore. We lost a long time ago. Like, paint pictures, go farm. Like, this is done, right? And I was watching that, and I caught myself like, you'd think that your cultural hero tells you to give up. This would be this like horrible, tragic moment. But I caught myself really feeling like relieved, and I was wondering like, okay, why am I feeling good about that talk? And I started thinking like there's actually some empowerment in admitting loss, right? And thinking about how you can kind of own the loss and channel that into something else besides just seeping into depression and watching TV on the couch. And so that affected a lot of my thinking, like that whole course of events. And just a few months ago, that affected the Fat Lab. So the Fat Lab we decided to close down, not 100% with 100% agreement, but with a majority of agreement from the group. And I was talking about this just recently before the talk with some people, and there's many different reasons for why that group kind of fell apart. But a lot of it for me had to do with the fact that the internet had changed a lot, and our approach that we were using, like this idea of radical entertainment, like it wasn't working anymore. Like that approach worked for a specific moment on the web, and we didn't move fast enough to figure out what the next thing was, what the next loophole in the media was. And I started feeling that like we were these like comedians on the Titanic, like telling jokes as the whole ship was going down. And at one point, like after hearing that talk from Peter, I started thinking like, well, maybe rather than telling jokes as the ship's going down, we could just tell everybody goodbye. Like, what a more powerful statement is that, like, than just laughing and poking Google in the eye with our jokes, you know? And so that thinking led to the kind of conversations that FAT was having and why we closed. And so then that led me, again, to coming back to that feeling that I had. Like, how do I rekindle that feeling that I had when I was back in school and probably pretty naive about what the internet was, but also kind of full of optimism. And optimism leads to energy and productivity, right? Like when you're trying to make something, like operating from a point of depression is not a good place, right? And when it's hard to get out of bed, you're probably not going to be all that productive. And I'm not a depressive person. And so I was trying to figure out how to rekindle some of that work. And so I started over. I started thinking, okay, if I'm going to try to refresh this relationship I have with the internet, maybe I need to come to a better understanding of what the internet is. And so this is a Google image search for the word internet, right? And so when you do this, if you were like an alien coming down to Earth and trying to figure out what we think the internet is by doing this search, you'd think that it was kind of like glowing blue light, basically, right? Like maybe some clouds and maybe some Internet Explorer logos, but we clearly don't have a very good public conception of what is the internet. And so I started looking into this, and I think that there's a wave of research and artists looking into this now for maybe similar reasons. Like I think that there's, once you go through this kind of like, almost this loss of innocence with something, or this rift in trust, like trying to understand what that thing is, I think is a natural reaction. And so for me, I started looking into like what the internet was, like what does it feel like to hold the internet? What does it look like when the internet goes under the oceans? What does it look like when the internet comes out of the ocean and meets the land? I started reading books there's this one by Andrew Bloom called Tubes, which is maybe the sort of quintessential internet. If you're interested in sort of internet pilgrimages, this is a good place to start. And he talks a lot about how the internet has no monuments, right? That there's, for this thing that touches all of us every day, all the time, there's no place to kind of go there and commune with it. This is a photo from his blog in Nova Scotia, which is just this like lonely manhole cover, like out in the middle of nowhere, right? But what you realize is that the internet, of course, is not a cloud, which we all know, and that it is visitable, like you can find it. They don't make it as easy to find because for some obvious reasons, but it is out there. And so this was like one strain of research that I was going down, and I'm continuing to go down. And I'm gonna take a left turn here, but stay with me, right? There's a second research thread I kind of found myself falling into based on just like long days of surfing the internet, where I kept ending up in websites that were selling ghost hunting devices, right? And in terms of like re-falling in love with technology, ghost hunting is a great way to re-fall in love with technology. And so the connection for me, though, is that there's a community of people that are trying to document evidence of paranormal activity, right? And the way they define paranormal activity is disembodied human energy. And so for me, this was like, I'm not looking for ghosts. Like, I mean, to be 100% honest, I don't believe in ghosts, right? But the approach that they're taking is an approach that I think is not only interesting technically, but also sort of as a metaphor towards how a lot of us have a relationship with technology. And because of the way they define what they're looking for as this disembodied human energy, to me this was a connection to what I was looking for, like a lot of this energy that's ending up flowing through fiber optic cables and ending up on servers. And so I started looking more and more into what they were doing, the tools that they were using. I also had this interest in sort of visualizing these invisible networks, right, in terms of coming up with art practices that can kind of show us what the internet is. And they have tools that are also dealing with this, right? They shoot a lot of full spectrum video, which is like the visible color spectrum with like near infrared and near ultraviolet light, thinking that this might be an alternative visual spectrum that they could capture ghosts in. I'll show just a video. I spent a lot of time like on YouTube because there's a ton of people ghost hunting, you know? A lot of them are where I come from, like the Midwest in the US, right? It's like a kind of a boring place to grow up, and I think if you don't do drugs when you're young, you probably end up ghost hunting, right? There's not that much to do there. So this is one from the Midwest Spirit Group. This is one of many, but just to give you an idea of like what this practice is.
This is a device that you guys can come forward, any spirits, and speak with me. So if you have a message, please come forward and speak to me into this device. Hi, tell me your name.
And so he's shooting in full spectrum. The audio you're hearing is from a common ghost hunting technique called a spirit box, which is essentially a hacked radio that never lands on a station. But even the way he's addressing them, right? Like, if you have a message, please speak to me into this device, right? I saw this and I was just thinking, like, okay, this is like exactly a metaphor for what we're all doing right now, you know? And they're also kind of like a self-aware community, like to be respected within the paranormal hunting community at the moment. Skepticism is like a badge of pride. Like, you have to debunk as many ghost hunting expeditions as you do. Like, for every photo that you're holding up saying this is evidence of a ghost, you better have like 50 or 100 that you said were not, right? Because they talk about this idea of matrixing a lot. And matrixing is connected to apophenia or pareidolia, like this idea that the human brain is wired to find patterns in randomness, right? So it's why we see faces when we look at the clouds, or we see smiley faces in the craters of Mars. It's like we're somehow hardwired to do this. And this is a community that's very aware of this. And they might be more aware of it than perhaps we are when we're dealing with our own technologies, right? And so when I see these things like 5,807 friend requests, this is not my account, but I think like that maybe we're matrixing too, right? Like maybe we're trying to find these patterns in randomness that aren't there, trying to see these things that aren't there, and how, as much as it seems like this strange problem that they're trying to solve by making technology to talk to the afterlife, it doesn't seem that much different than the fact that we're trying to point at technology for solving all life's problems, right? And being able to communicate them clearly in 18 minutes or 120 seconds. And so I started trying to think of ghost hunting as this metaphor for thinking about technology in a greater way, but also a technical way of hunting for the internet. So I'm trying to think, how much more time do I have here? How much time should I keep talking for? 20 minutes? Do I have 20 minutes? Okay. So the first sort of internet pilgrimage I took was to Cornwall in the UK. So this is like the westernmost tip of the UK, and it's where 25% of the global internet traffic comes. It's like, if you're gonna visit the internet, this is like arguably one of the places to go. Also has this beautiful history of being the same beaches where pirates used to hide their boats. standing circles. It's the exact same beaches where the telegraph came ashore in 1870. It's the same beach where Marconi was first sending wireless radio waves over the Atlantic, like all happening within like a couple miles. And so I planned my route through this area, trying to find these fiber optic cables. I developed my gear, I built some gear, I bought some gear. And I used advice that I'd read from Neil Stephenson, who wrote this amazing article called Mother Earth Motherboard, which I think I have linked to somewhere here. And he says, if you're trying to visit the internet, follow the manholes, right? And so I got there, and you'd end up in these, like, a lot of them were like little surfer beaches, and it'd be this out in the middle of nowhere parking lot with like 50 manholes, right? It was like an internet nerd's paradise. Or I'd be driving down these little farm lanes, and all of a sudden one driveway had like 4 massive manhole covers with telecom names on it. And so then when you look down the driveway, you see this thing that kind of looks like a British country home. But when you see the sort of blackout curtains and the extra security devices, you'd kind of quickly recognize that this is an internet landing station. But these kind of like more technical things weren't really what I was interested in, maybe more like personally or artistically. Like what I really wanted to feel was like, again, like trying to reforge this relationship with the internet. Like what does it feel like to go to these places and to stand on top of this like tube of glass with lasers firing down it and like terabytes of information, right? And so it had more to do with like something that Andrew Bloom talks about in the book, which is like you go out looking for these telecommunications, these massive networks of communication, and you end up finding yourself alone every single time, right? Sometimes with no cell service, with no 3G service. Like for engineering reasons, the places where the cables come ashore are intentionally not where people are fishing. It's not where people are pulling boats in. And so they end up being these really, really remote locations. And so there's this, other people have talked about it, but experiencing it was actually like really interesting. Like I have another trip coming up in Sweden, and there's a part of gearing up for these trips that it's like, it's like this sort of like stepping away from the screen. Not that you're not thinking about these issues, but then going out into this sort of like meditative environment where you're just completely alone, left with only these like little clues that you're standing amongst this like telecommunications network. In the UK, the only physical signs that you'll get of the internet are these wooden diamond-shaped signs that just say telephone cable, which is amazing, right? It's like all this stuff that's happening that I feel like is pretty defining of our time on Earth here together. And it has this amazing moment of transition where it exits the sea and meets the land, and there's this like wooden pole that says telephone cable on it. And to me, this was like so beautiful. It's like this like really anticlimactic understatement, right? And so these photos were some of the ones I was taking on this first trip. I was, at the same time as taking these photos, I was also taking readings on these ghost hunting devices. And yeah, this is one called the Ovilus 3 from Digital Dowsing, which is a pretty amazing name for a company that makes ghost tech. And I ended up showing them as this series of prints, which are impossible to see here. But you have they're a single print with an image on top, and then laser etched into the white space below on the surface of the glass are these readouts from the ghost hunting device that was taken at the same location. And so it's meant to be this sort of pairing of digital analog and spiritual and real, and it's also meant to have this like, it's also meant to be viewed in the same way that I was out there viewing it, right? Where I would find myself kind of out there looking out at the landscape and then looking down at my phone and looking out at the landscape and looking down at the phone. And so for people that come to the show and see these in person, the print is meant to have that same sort of experience where you're seeing these moments that I'm sort of capturing at these fiber optic landing locations, and then you're sort of looking down to read the digital. So this was one series. Let's see if I can get through one more here. More recently, this is all like catching up to like today, right? So this is now maybe 3 months ago. I went to New Zealand, which has this also kind of interesting connection to the internet, which is essentially 2 points. Like they have the Southern Cross cable network, which comes in on the west coast from Australia, and then crosses this, oh, you can't even see it. It crosses this little tiny patch of the North Island that you can drive across in like a half an hour, and then it goes off to the US and comes back. And so they have these like 2 points, you know? And so before I went, I was like looking more into, okay, again, I'm like trying to nail down like how can I get a closer relationship to the internet? Like what is it? Like what is firing down those fiber optic cables, right? And my understanding of it, and if there's engineers in the room, please shout if I'm telling this wrong, is that what's essentially going down the fiber optic cable is infrared laser light. And it's happening in this very narrow spectrum that centers around 1,550 nanometers, which is the length of that electromagnetic wave. And so if we had the right kind of hardware, this is what we would see if we held that cable up, right? We would see this wavelength happening and firing down there. And that wavelength, like this little tiny sliver in the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum is visible light. It's blown up here, but really that's all that spectrum has that we see naturally with our eyes. And the region that 1,550 nanometers happens in is what they call the near infrared region, right? And a cool thing about the near infrared region is that almost every digital camera that we have now can read near infrared, right? They're manufactured with these little blue infrared blocking chips that are fused on top of the CCD, but you can take your camera apart, which I've been getting slowly better and better at, and you can just pop this off and replace it with a clear piece of glass or with an infrared lens, and you can be shooting video and photographic footage in a similar near-infrared spectrum that the internet is sort of based in. And so the photos that I came back with from this New Zealand trip were all shot using this camera that I'd kind of finally figured out how to hack. It was like I don't have that much good gear, right? And so it's really nerve-wracking to take your expensive camera that you couldn't replace if it broke and take it all the way down to the CCD and then put it back together. But I put it back together and it worked. And I took that to shoot these locations, again, I wasn't looking to have a shot of the cable necessarily. Like sometimes the cable will be in the frame. Like here, if you could see the actual image, there's a very small cable that comes out of the water and meets the cliff there. Or in this one in the stream, you can kind of see this quiet moment where the cable comes out. But it wasn't, my interest again wasn't really so much in physically visualizing the cable, but more in sort of capturing this feeling of like an experience with the web. Standing in proximity of the web. And so sometimes it was even, nothing would be in the frame that you could see, right? But the cable's kind of flowing underneath this tree, which then kind of becomes this like splintering network diagram itself and meets at the base where the cable goes under. And to me, these things were all kind of like beautiful and happening. I could watch it through this lens where I felt like I kind of had this internet vision. And I used that to make a series of, this is now we're entering works in progress, okay? These aren't finished yet. But this is, what I'm working on now is turning this video footage, which I'll show just for a second here. There's a series of kind of these like single tripod shot, video shot in this infrared spectrum. The audio is happening from a custom spirit box that I've made and will release soon that's operating under the same principles as spirit boxes do in the paranormal community, only instead of scanning through the radio linearly, I've hooked it up to a pulse sensor so that I looked really weird. Like I'd be at the beach with this like contraption rigged up to my finger, and then my pulse was controlling the radio frequency. So it's like trying to add in, there's all these like rhythms happening with the wave, the electromagnetic frequency, and then my pulse that's like skipping through this radio spectrum. So the audio you hear is essentially my heart rate controlling a radio that's then skipping through this radio frequencies. And then all that turns into these videos that are either going to be websites or networked video. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to finalize them, but they're going to be hosted in the same places from which I shot them. So this video, if you view it in the browser the way it's meant to be viewed, the video file is hosted on a server in New Zealand, so that when the browser tries to load it in, the data is then being converted into infrared light, which is the same visual spectrum of the video is visually in, and then it's firing through this laser beam that's then going underneath this triangular sign. So that triangular sign is the New Zealand cable landing locations, which if you're a fan of the sort of Pirate Bay and you're into the idea of copy me, like the fact that a triangle represents the internet is like fucking amazing, right? Like I was freaking the fuck out when I saw that. If there's any copy me nerds in here. So then the final sort of thing I'm thinking the way these pieces will function is then the URL, if you copy and paste the URL and you type that into Google Maps and you hit enter, it'll take you to the exact location that the camera was located. Because the URL then functions as both an address in the network, as an IP address, and as a GPS coordinate. So the URLs will all be GPS coordinates as well as IP coordinates. And so you can go into Google Maps And then if you go into Street View, you can see the triangular sign and tree here. So that it becomes this like merging of these two things into one, right? And it's really meant to be this sort of, like this experience of the network. And I take a lot of cues from this like earlier round of net art that was happening, where this is like this classic net art diagram that people point to a lot, right? But this still influences me a lot. Like I try to hold my own work up to this when I'm making work that's on the internet and make sure that it needs to be there. Like, is this work that's actually happening in the browser, or is this just an aesthetic that's being thrown into a Tumblr page, right? And so I'm thinking about this diagram and trying to like remove a tiny bit of the abstraction by then like overlaying that diagram on top of this cable network map. I could end there. I could do like 2 more minutes. I'll do 2 more. I'll do the last one really quick. So the last one I'm going to show, and this is like this was something that is currently on display. I just finished it like maybe 5 weeks ago. It's a project that's a new series I'm working on, and I filmed this footage in Paraguay for the first International Asuncion Biennial is going on right now, and this is work that's in that show, so it was all shot there. It's working in the same spectrum, using the same camera, only instead of looking at this node in the network that are in these moments of transition where the fiber optic cables land on the beach, I'm instead looking at the end point of the network, right? And so the construct I set up is I have this infrared filming station that I set up in my hotel room, and as I met people in Paraguay and Asuncion, I would invite them to come up, which is a super weird invitation. Like, will you come up to my hotel room and put your camera on the system? And then the invitation was like, and just waste time. Like getting back to that same idea of Angry Birds, that idea of casual computing. Like, I'm interested in just seeing, the invitation was just use your phone the same way you would use it if you were really bored, which is probably what you are right now, right? And so the interesting kind of phenomenon that happens when you film a phone in the infrared spectrum is that you get this inversion that happens where, because the pixels aren't emitting any infrared light, even though the user sees the screen perfectly, the camera doesn't see anything. And even though the user doesn't see this little glowing light that happens on all your iPhones, the infrared camera picks it up, right? So the pixels that it's flipped, okay? This little light is happening on all your iPhones all the time when you hit this button, like it's shining right now. And so this visual spectrum is kind of inverted, right? And so I met with as many people as I could convince to enter into this kind of strange situation. And the piece was kind of about like, it's again like trying to get back to, it's related to the multi-touch series in the sense that it's about these gestures that we're being asked to perform by user experience designers, by companies, and all these things that we're doing, and removing the interface from that so that we just see the dance that the people are doing. I'll just show a few seconds of what one of those videos looks like. Getting more and more interested in thinking about like everything that FatLab did, trying to do it slightly differently, right? Or almost like the exact opposite. Like instead of making work that's like really digestible quickly and plays well on the internet, like now I'm making work that like does terrible on the internet, and it feels so good. And so I'll end there. But like, I think hopefully some of the themes that I was talking about in the earlier work that I was showing, like these ideas of this relationship between misuse and empowerment, or this notion of sort of visualizing the invisible. It's not that I think that they're still present in this current round of work, but the current round of work is really, hopefully like me working through a kind of an honest way to form a new relationship with like an internet landscape that I see is sort of irrevocably changed. So I'll leave it there. If you want these slides, I have the link, and my email is here. So thank you very much for your time, and maybe we have some time for a few questions. Or you have a few questions. We can use the same mic, right?
Do you have your water here, or you need it, or you want this?
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Evan, for this great presentation, I must say. I wanted to start maybe by mentioning this movie that was actually shown this morning by Alain René, and I think it was from the early 30s, 53, about the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it was actually this huge optimistic film about the library, and that it collected and archived like everything that was published in France. And then at one moment, they also mentioned the scanning of newspapers, like the microfiche. And they were speaking about a fantôme. And I actually really like that in comparison to your work and with the phantom. Yeah. So you speak a lot about this visualizing the invisible, the sort of trying to reconnect or rekindle to the internet. So this sort of new embodiments, and you do that in sort of different ways. You've got the more sort of ghost hunting disembodiment, or how was it called? That the disembodied human energy that you're looking for. So there are like a couple of questions here that I'm interested in. One is, for instance, this it also has to do with this sort of nostalgia, this sort of pilgrimage that you mentioned at one point. I think it was only in the title, actually. You don't mention actually the word pilgrimage, but and of course you elaborate quite a bit on it in the presentation, but can you maybe say a bit more about the pilgrimage?
There's a connection there actually to the ghost hunting community too, because they of course aren't like, they don't have these devices out around their like bagel and coffee in the morning. You know, like for them, they need to go to what they call areas of activity. So, and it might be some of the things you think, like abandoned hospitals or battlefields are big. Like these are big pilgrimage points for that community. But for example, graveyards are not, because this is not like an area of activity. And so this was like another connection I saw to the sort of pilgrimage I wanted to take too, which wasn't necessarily to the data centers. Like I was more interested in these areas of activity where like the data was sort of flowing and there are these weird moments of transition. And so I was trying to take cues from the way they undergo their investigations and their own pilgrimages and sort of incorporate that into my own. Like use their same moves, but like applied to a different thing.
Yeah, 'cause in some texts I read also about the sort of learnings that you had from these people, and maybe you can also compare it a bit maybe to the hacker culture, or how that relates to that for you.
To me, it reminds me of the graffiti community a little bit too, because it's a community of people that don't really have a market serving their tech. And graffiti used to be this too. Like now there's companies that sell spray paint and markers that are designed for graffiti writers. But when that community was in its development, there was no company selling that. I mean, even the idea of buying spray paint at one point was like a big hack. Like that was a big change. Like someone had this idea that, okay, instead of pointing this at my lawn chair, I'm going to point that at your house and write my name. Like that was like a huge move, right? And there wasn't companies filling the void to supply them with their tools. And the ghost hunting community is the same way. Like there's something like when I get these devices, like like a lot of them are like 3D printed. You can see they're just some dude probably in his garage, like this guy Bill Chappell who runs the digital dowsing. I follow him on Twitter now. He's got like MakerBots in his garage, and they're all 3D printed and made to order. And they come and they're kind of strange, and like when I travel with them, I hope that customs doesn't ask about them because they don't have like the CE registration or anything. But that kind of like handmade, made in the garage, DIY kind of thing it's really alive and well in that community. And you kind of feel it, like when you're searching through these websites that sell them. It's like if there's some honesty in the way that they're created that I feel like is lacking in a lot of the technology we have relationships with now. So in that way, that was another way for me to get excited. Like I was like, as new technologies would come out, like I found myself getting less and less excited. Like whatever, the Connect comes out or drones come out, and it just feels like oof a little bit, you know? But then when I found myself digging through these ghost hunting websites, I was really like, whoa, what the fuck are they doing? Like, that's interesting, you know? This is something.
And related to this, the why and all the sort of manual labor that goes into, you know, producing these things, and also the Angry Birds and the slide, unslide, you know, all these things that take a lot of effort and a lot of work. Could you say maybe a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, making art takes work, right? I mean, the people...
But you don't necessarily need to make that visible. I mean, you make that visible.
And people have different art practices, and I don't think... I mean, for example, like I really like Corey Archangel's work we saw earlier, and I think Corey's really brilliant at making something that actually has a lot of substance look super simple, right? Whether it's the gradient paintings or these like very small changes he makes to larger systems. I think he's super good at this, and he makes it look really easy. And so I'm maybe trying to do that in some of the work. Like some of it maybe looks like less work than it is in a sense. Like, I mean, even these like slide down locks that I think look like they're probably super easy to make. Like it took me a while to figure out what device I need to be scanning that on, who has that in Paris, who has the printer to make, like all the things that go into coming away with like an art object. I think maybe the trick, Corey addresses this in his presentation too, is that like if it doesn't feel like fun, if it doesn't feel like there was something light on top of all the research as well, I think it maybe doesn't have as good a chance of communicating. So if some of them feel easy, I actually like that because they don't necessarily, I don't come to them so easily sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, you spoke a bit about the FED Lab, the Free Art and Technology Lab, and the closing down of it. How do you feel? I mean, is there still work to be done, like in the public domain? You feel, or do you, yeah, just focusing now on a sort of different strand in trying to reconnect to the internet again, or is there still sort of responsibility for you, or for other artists maybe?
Yeah. No, it's a good question.
Yeah, also since Ramon Amaro, for instance, is speaking on Sunday, I think. And I know he's very much into this ethics and you know, the sort of responsibility that he thinks we should all have in regard to how we should act online and well, maybe I shouldn't say too much about what he's going to tell, but about this, the algorithms, the big data mining, and how that's all going to affect future decisions from corporations and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel these responsibilities too, and if anything, I came more from the free software movement than I did from the arts, and so a lot of that is really core to what I'm doing. But yeah, again, like I feel like we kind of know what the answers are. It's what we were talking about in the panel, Ali and I, a little bit. Where it's like, or what Evgeny was talking about. It's like, I feel like we know what the problems are. I feel like we know what we're supposed to do, and then it's just a question of like, do we think it's possible or not? And like, I think I'm like oscillating a little bit. Like I think my pendulum has swung really far in one direction right now, and this work is me struggling to get back. But at the moment, I'm not hopeful for the internet. Like I'm looking for the next thing. Like I think cryptography is important, but to me this feels like sort of sneaking around somebody else's house still. You know, like lately what I've been getting excited about is radio again. Like I've been looking at sort of ham radio communities and people that are doing communication without anyone else's infrastructure. I mean, the FCC, of course, is trying to regulate all the airwaves, but there's still this community of people that are making their own technology, communicating totally without the system, and they seem really interesting to me. I don't know what I'm going to do there, but I'm studying for my ham radio license right now to try to find out. I mean, and it's not crazy to think that something might replace the internet either, because the other research I was doing was about the history of the telegraph and the history of the radio and how nothing we're living through now is as new and different as we think, right? And like radio only had a 10 to 15 year heyday before TV kind of basically didn't make it irrelevant, but kind of changed it into something different. And so the idea that we might see some totally different shift in our lifetime is probably not that crazy, right? I've been getting, like, I showed this slide of like the electromagnetic spectrum, and when I'm sort of getting depressed, I look at that too, because I think the answer is there. Like somewhere in that electromagnetic spectrum, you know, it's like we have like visual art, which happens in the visual spectrum, and then you kind of get into infrared, which is sort of the internet, and then microwaves, which is like cell phone and Wi-Fi, and then you go deeper down the spectrum, you get into radio and TV, and it's like the answer's there somewhere, you know, I think. So that's what I'm...
Still a phantom.
Yeah, maybe.
So yeah, what do you, how do you call your sort of approach? Do you think you have still sort of like a hacker approach, or is it just using all different kinds of approaches, or?
Yeah, I mean, I still think in the current work I'm doing, I still see a lot of those themes of like the misuse of technology to tell different stories. Like I hope that thread is still there, because it feels like a big part of kind of like why I'm making art. Even though kind of my thinking about the network and it's the way we are related to it has changed a lot, I don't feel like my practice has changed as much as maybe I'm talking about it. Like, I don't feel like my practice has changed quite as much as my worldview of the internet has changed.
Just different ways of
a similar approach
visualizing,
towards solving different problems, yeah.
And also in presenting your work, I mean, you still sort of function within a sort of gallery context or public space or internet, or?
I'm trying to distribute my art practice and like find money wherever it is. And so, yeah, so I have one strain of work that's happening in galleries, which is or if I would say indoors. Like for a while I wasn't making anything that happened indoors. I was just doing public space and internet related work, which is where I still feel like I come from. And I used to really hate art that happened inside. But that's changed for me a lot too, especially the way I'm thinking about how time affects work. And now those spaces are getting more interesting to me, because I think that we're ready for long format, right? Like I think we're culturally getting really tired of 13-minute TED Talks and 120 character tweets. And you see it with things like podcasting, right? Like long format interviews are coming back. And I think, I mean, I know I'm like reading more lately. Like I'm getting so tired of I think we're all getting like tired of this next scroll situation. And so I think that there's a medium for long format. And I think the gallery, for how antiquated it is, actually sets up a system for that. Like you're making this place where people are investing time to come see it, and you're going to get more of their attention. And you're going to get a longer span of attention with which to try to communicate ideas. And I'm not saying I'm only focused on the gallery, but I think it is something that interests me now. And I think also because I'm interested in how this work ages, there's something interesting about addressing that community too, where like we were talking about being collectors. Like to me, for as horrible as, there's like so many things we could talk about, like the influence of money on art. But like I'm trying to find paths of optimism through that system as well. And one of the paths of optimism I find there is this notion of having a timeline that art can exist on a longer thing. Like we saw with Corey's movie, right? Like you have this museum that's fulfilling this function, and now we can see these new images from Warhol, right? Like there's something about that system that is interesting me for the way the internet functions, because we need something to archive it, because it's just moving so quickly and it doesn't get recorded that much. And it's surprising how little visual evidence we have of the web from not that long ago.
Speaking about archiving, Hito Steyler, for instance, got a question about archiving and you know, how to decide what you will save. And then she said, well, it's more a question of what to get rid of. And I was thinking also of your sort of portraits.
Yeah. I have a related piece called Forgetting Spring, which is where I take 3 months of those prints and put them in a trash compactor and like compress it down to one little cube. Because that's built into the work too for me. It's like, yeah, this idea of like computer memory and what the computer what you want it to remember and what you want it to forget so that you can tell other stories. Like,
yeah, it's really difficult that it stores so much information at the same time, unwanted as well.
Yeah, and it's connected to this sort of spying state too. It's like you operate different. I operate different too, especially in the beginning of recording all that archiving of the internet cache. Like I was for a while very aware that I was recording it. Like I was aware that I was going to have to print this out someday and put it in a museum, and I've been getting, I think, better at training myself to forget about that. But when we know people are looking, we behave different. Like the conversations, when we know people are reading our email, we send different emails, we send different text messages. And I think that those conversations are sort of built into that idea of what we forget and what we remember as well. Like if we aren't forgetting anything, we're not freeing ourselves from being able to have conversations that maybe we need to be having.
Yeah. So in the end, you're an optimist?
Yeah.
I think it might be time to open up to the audience. Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you very much. That was a really lovely lecture. Wonderful presentation. But I don't agree with you on one point, which is that you say that your work, your recent work, is actually similar to what you did before with FatLab. I think it's completely different. Well, do I have to explain why? I think that it's much more contemplative. And you also talk about getting closer to the internet again, and you're saying that the electromagnetic spectrum is where the answer is. So my question is, what is the question? What are you looking for? And what exactly do you want? What do you hope to find? Where are you going?
I mean, I think on a bigger scale, I think I want what a lot of artists want, which is you want to be able to record and talk about the world you live in, right? I mean, I think a lot of art falls into that camp. And in that way, I feel like that's kind of what I'm doing. That's what I want to do. Because I feel like a lot of the art that's happening now that's surrounding the internet, especially more recently, not to be too pessimistic, but it doesn't really do that for me. It doesn't, a lot of the art that is being talked about now as being the art of our generation doesn't feel like the art that I want to be remembered of my generation producing.
Can you give examples?
With the cameras and everything, like on the internet? No, I think that there's great work happening now, but I also think some of the work that's coming out of what people are labeling as the post-internet art movement doesn't, some of it's great, but a lot of it doesn't feel to me like what we should be talking about right now. And I'm not saying that my work is doing that, but when you ask what I want to be making that work. I want to be making work that's relevant to the generation we're living in, and that we're going to feel like when we look back on it correctly described the decisions that we were making and the things that we were going through, like the same as I think artists have done for a long time. Does that answer it a little bit, or? I think, and to maybe to address your statement about the work being different pre and post FatLab, I agree with that. I think maybe what I was saying is that I think the initial impetus or like the initial spark of creativity, like the thought process I go through when I'm trying to solve problems, I don't think has changed that much. I agree what I'm making is different and the approach is different.
Yeah, so in a sense, you are doing the exact opposite of what the post-internet movement does. So
I don't think that's true.
Yes. But I was wondering, okay, so you can explain or like elaborate on that in the answer. But do you see around you that like also other artists are taking the same approach as you do? So, you know, is it a movement? You know, for example, I could imagine that if this art piece of you visiting those physical places where the internet enters the shores and things, that they will become places for people to visit. You know, if this spreads, it will actually, you know, potentially become sort of pilgrimage places, not just in a metaphorical way, but in a real way, that people go there because they heard about it. So I was wondering, do you see a movement around this approach that you are taking with your art and with your approach to the internet that you've been taking for the last years?
Okay, I think I've got it. So, why I was saying I don't think what I'm doing is the exact opposite of what's happening in the post-internet art movement, because I think at its core with that movement, I don't even think there maybe is a movement. People are trying to figure out if there is one, but I think the question they're trying to wrestle with, if I understand it, is they're talking about a moment in time when computing became ubiquitous, and that was a sort of interesting moment, right? The moment when, what is it you say, like the moment when everybody has had to learn Microsoft Word? You know, there's these moments in the history of computing, and I think that the marker that the post-internet movement is using is correct. I just feel like the approach of a lot of the work, it isn't the way that I would describe it. And so that's just like maybe a caveat to say that I think where they're coming from is like a correct standpoint. Like to say that this thing has happened and it's worth making artwork about and trying to describe how we're all reacting to it. The second question about, yes, specifically, are there other people doing work surrounding these physical locations? Yes. Ingrid Bergman's doing really amazing research. Trevor Paglin's doing work. There's a growing number of people that are investigating like infrastructure as a way of coming to greater understanding. I don't think there's enough there to call that a movement yet, but I think that if I was going to describe what a movement could be, it wouldn't necessarily be related to having to have visiting the infrastructure be the answer, but just that there might be other artists out there working in ways that are trying to answer the questions that the post-internet art movement is set up to answer, but doing it in a way that is maybe, I think, maybe more honest or maybe more personal or maybe more true to what I felt going through and maybe what we all feel going through this generation.
It's a bit of a pithy question maybe for that introduction, but I just wanted, with your communication or at least relationship with the ghost hunting community, are they aware of what you're doing or how you're using their technologies? And if so, do they see any correlation between what you're doing and what they're doing in terms of like what you're searching for?
For the most part, no. I've started using the hashtag ghost hunting on certain photos that I post, and those are the first places where I started to pick up followers from that community. I don't have a big entry point to that community yet. The piece I showed with the pulse monitor scanning through the radio, that was built from an open source ghost hunting design that this guy Bill Chappell released. And so when that project is ready, when I've sort of finished with that piece and it's ready for public release, like the idea is that I would release this as a sort of a open hardware, open software project. And that's gonna be the first time when I try to maybe directly address that community, which I haven't done yet. Like, I wanna make sure I have something to offer them that's not just like an artist like approach to what they're doing, because I think that tool could actually be used for the exact same things they're using their current tools for, and it could bring back this idea of the medium. Like in the spiritualist movement, a lot of times would have the idea that humans would be mediums between one world and the afterworld, right? And that technology is something that marries that idea of having a person be at the center, but also this idea of the spirit box. And so I'm kind of hopeful that that project might be an entry point for me to have made a tool that would be useful to that community, not in an artistic way, but like in a technical way. But for the most part, I haven't had that many interactions yet. Is that the ending ringtone?
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's a question or maybe just a comment to the previous exchange about the post-internet, and it was used now as such a phrase appeared post-internet movement, art movement, and I'm absolutely sure that there is no such a movement. Maybe it's post-internet, it's a phenomenon to observe, and maybe there is a movement of curators who are interested in post-internet art, but there is no such movement. Sorry to bring some clearance.
And that's a really good place to end.
Didn't you say something like that about net art as well?
Shall we drink?